Hi, everyone, and welcome to the A4S Online Summit session on how we can accelerate the transition through the use of AI, decision-making tools, and scenario analysis. I'm Brad Sparks. I lead A4S's work in the US and will be the host for today's session. During this session, we're going to explore the use of scenario analysis and transition planning to enable effective decisions to be taken, as well as dive into the potential for AI and other technologies to provide some of the answers. Later in the session, my colleague Kira Burke will be speaking with Rob Doepel, Managing Partner for Sustainability in the UK and Ireland EY, and Jojo Rouse, Senior Manager, Climate Change and Sustainability Services, also at EY, and they'll provide some insights on market trends and the role of finance within transition planning. But first, I'm joined by two leaders bringing complementary perspectives on this topic. George Quinn is non-executive director at Swiss Re and until recently the CFO of Zurich Insurance, and Alice Steenland is Chief Strategy, Sustainability, and Marketing Officer at Signify, a global leader in lighting technologies. George and Alice are also two of our Fast Track Task Force chairs, and they'll be able to bring in some of the insights from the work that we've been doing with them over the past year. George and Alice, thank you for being here today. George, maybe if I can come to you first, through the A4S Fast Track project, we've been exploring some of the action areas that have the greatest potential to accelerate progress towards sustainable outcomes. And you've been chairing the task force on decision making. I guess from your perspective of the task force, but also as a board member, as a former CFO, what are you seeing as some of the biggest barriers that organizations are facing when they think about aligning decision-making with the transition to a sustainable economy?
I think one of the biggest challenges is timeline. If you think of how a typical finance function works, maybe there's a financial plan that has got a strategic timeline to it, so maybe it's a 3 or 5 year view of the world. If you look at what a lot of the effort goes into, it's typically more that 1 year budget, maybe 18 months if a company's doing some kind of rolling forecast. There are certainly, there'll be important things that are going to happen in that period, but it tends to be a bit shorter than you would need to look at to have a bigger impact on transition. I think if you look at other parts of what finance people do, maybe projects. So if you're investing, if you're acquiring, then you'll typically see much longer time horizons. But in fact, one of the things that came up when we had a recent meeting amongst the members of the various task forces was that, of course, when you look at those longer term financial projections, you discount obviously more heavily the more you get into the future. So the impact of those later years tends to be much smaller than the impact of those early years. So you've got that challenge of trying to change the way that finance thinks about things from its traditional viewpoint, certainly from a time horizon perspective.
So how, I guess on that, the timeline and time horizon perspective, do you have any kind of practical solutions to how to address that? Like how are you seeing organizations tackle that longer term perspective?
So I think it depends how you use this tool, but if you think of, lots of companies will do, there'll be different names for it. So there'll be crisis scenarios, war gaming. So you might work with your boards and your executive teams to test decision-making behavior, test how well the organization functions in a difficult set of circumstances. And in those types of scenario, or those types of processes rather, you don't see the same effects of time value of money because it's designed that you live in the period. And I think we've looked at that in the decision-making framework task force. Certainly in the world that I'm familiar with, which is financial services, it's a tool that's already used. The scenarios that are used today tend to be maybe a bit simpler than you're going to have to evaluate transition more thoroughly. But you can certainly build on the technology that people use already around those topics to extend it and make what people look at from a transition perspective just far more relevant.
Yeah, and in particular, right, this is an area for the insurance sector where
Mhm.
there's a real need to have that longer term perspective as well. I guess, given your experience within the sector, are there any, specific examples that you think other sectors could learn from, based on how the insurance sector has approached this?
So some yes, some no. I mean, if you look at what insurance companies do, I mean, certainly if you take exposure to um, natural perils, so windstorm, earthquake, etc., there'll be lots of different types of modeling. I mean, typically very highly mathematical, very sophisticated studies that look at storm tracks, look at dependencies. I mean, the challenge with those things is that insurance companies tend to write contracts for about 12 months. So we're back to that timeline problem again. I mean, there will be a longer term perspective in it, but certainly the more sophisticated modeling that you see on climate topics, certainly from an insurance pricing perspective, I'm not sure that's really going to be something that would change people's capabilities in other industries. I think one thing that does, or that could make a difference, I mean, back to that scenario modeling thing, it is something that regulated industries that are capital intensive will typically do because you need to look for, I mean, scenarios that can challenge the organization that maybe your more traditional deterministic planning scenarios just don't bring up. And in particular for me, one of the things I find really interesting is that depending on who your regulator is, certainly in the insurance world, your regulator might expect you to have a scenario that you've tested that will lead to the failure of the organization. So it forces people to confront something that most of us typically want to avoid. And I think employing that same type of approach around scenario modeling, around climate, I think it can inject maybe more critical thought and certainly more realism into some of these longer term scenarios. Because if you look today at, I mean, disclosures that companies make, I think most companies are pretty good at the short term, identifying specific sustainability topics and their proposals and their actions to address it. So you find annual reports that are just chock full of this type of thing. If you look at the TCFD side of things, um, it doesn't seem to throw up too many problems, which is kind of counterintuitive given that there's so many things we don't know at this stage. So I think there's something about how we approach TCFD. Maybe it's around mitigation, assumptions about behavior that aren't really testing companies as much as it might. And I think having a different approach to the scenario side, including exhaustion scenarios, maybe even having more complex models, I mean, might throw up more interesting challenges because when you look at the totality of what we expect, it's not reflected in annual reports today.
Yeah, I think that's a common theme we're also hearing, through our asset owners network and through some of the pension plans we work with, is kind of the robustness of these scenarios and how they're thinking about, are they covering the breadth of some of the different things that could happen in the medium to long term, and need to improve that. So let me maybe step to you, Alice, and coming today from a different sector at Signify. What are you seeing? Are there similar challenges in thinking about this, and solutions of kind of aligning these issues and improving decision making?
Yes, I don't think, it's necessarily sector specific in the sense, especially in the broad, conclusion that George was sort of, hinting at. I mean, we're getting back to, Mark Carney's famous speech about the tragedy of the horizons, and I think all companies, especially listed companies, and that is you do see a slight distinction with some family-owned companies and non-listed corporations, but I think all of us who are within the listed markets, are working on this same rather short-term cycle. And it's very, very difficult to actually make investment decisions now or financial choices now for something that is outside of, as George said, probably even a 3-year time span, because that's usually what most strategy cycles are based on. So it's very, very difficult to have those conversations and then to put real risk assessments behind them. And that is, I think, independent of all of which sector you're operating in. It's more a question of um, uh, how close you are to the financial markets themselves. Yeah.
Well, one item that's been talked about a lot these days of how to improve and kind of think about different ways to look at improved decision making is around AI and technologies. And this is an area, again, another task force as part of the A4S Fast Track project. We were looking at where there is an opportunity to transform and improve financial decision making, whether that's automating analysis, providing new insights, expanding the boundaries of what's possible. Alice, you've been co-chair of that task force on AI and technologies, and I wonder if we can now kind of move into thinking about what are some of the examples of ways that you're seeing technology and AI change how businesses, including finance and accounting teams, really approach decision making, both in managing risk, but also supporting and driving sustainable outcomes.
Mm. I want to be careful on the topic of AI because there is so much, I think, hype and a lot of expectation about what it can do, and we've seen some research recently about the gap that corporates are experiencing between what they can the value they can actually get out of it today versus sort of what they think or hope that they can. So I want to be careful about that. I think some of the in terms of what's happening currently and how finance teams are currently using some of these systems, I'd say it's not that different from how other functions are using those systems. So it's a lot around productivity gains. We had in the work stream and workshops that we led, folks talking about examples of having your quarterly results, all the comments kind of automatically generated, or you can even turn them into a podcast to make them easier to understand, easier to digest for your audiences so they understand better the picture of the finances. So I think those are things that are transversal that all departments are experimenting with, and I think finance is a great example of teams that, at least in my experience, have really picked it up and found a lot of productivity gains and uses already in there. I think when we get to some of the more sophisticated things, some of the things that George was talking about, I mean, I think that's the hope for AI. I don't think it's fully materialized today, but this idea that, okay, yes, we're all doing risk planning or scenario planning, uh, but there are so many factors that go into imagining what the world might be like in a few years from now, much less in 10, 20 years from now. Um, that it's beyond the capacity of people to do that. And in fact, as long as I've been working in companies, when we do scenario planning, we always are very careful saying, it's not, we're never going to find the right scenario. It's about the process of going through the thinking that's important for the organization. When you start to add an AI layer in there, maybe you can get closer to what might be some actual, scenarios. And it's not only about the process, but a little bit more about the content, in the sense that you suddenly have the technological ability to really pull in so many different factors in a way that the human mind can't really capture. And so I am hopeful about that. I do think one of the main weaknesses of current scenario planning and risk management systems in organizations is that they are not mixing together. So this idea of like, well, what is like long-term credit risk, but then how does climate impact that? These are seen as two separate work streams. So we model a risk related to climate, and then we model a risk related to credit or something, and these are not connected. And I think that's not the way the world works. And possibly AI can help us get closer there in some of those basic functions around financial planning and especially risk management.
Yeah, I mean, on that question of the connectivity, right? We see that in a lot of spaces around sustainability in general. Of how are you connecting some of these sustainability issues with strategy, with financial reporting? Do you have any kind of, as you think about that challenge, any ideas of solutions or how you're seeing maybe companies starting to align these work streams?
So I mean, I don't have great examples. I have sort of within the sustainability space. If we take from AI used across organizations for productivity down to how maybe it applies to some financial services, and then maybe within that how you could apply it to sustainability. I mean, again, the use cases I see that are actually today being implemented and working quite well have a lot to do with sustainability data internally, making sure it's correct within our own company. We use sort of machine learning to correct for errors in sustainability data, and other kinds of data in the company. But that is a very clear way of how to get a better view of what's actually happening if you can just have better quality data, and AI can help with that, for sure. Then there's this other idea that has, we discussed in the workshops around. Well, there's actually a lot of external data on sustainability about your company or about your operations that you currently don't have ways to pull in. And I'm thinking like there were a lot of noise made about, for example, the satellites that can track methane emissions, right? So that actually know more about some methane emissions than the companies themselves who own those manufacturing sites or those extraction sites. So there is this layer of external data that can be AI enabled, that can suddenly feed into internal systems. And that's something that I think are starting to see a little bit of, but I think that definitely is a trend that we could see more of, which is actually there's external providers of data or external sources of data that will provide a mirror to the company about how you're performing on some sustainability issues or what your sustainability risks might be that you don't capture today. You're capturing your own very sort of standardized kind of indicators according to the reporting and your operations. But there's a whole bunch of other information, including non-structured information around what stakeholders are saying about you, or what reputation risks you might be facing. So all this sort of non-structured external data might be pulled into internal systems to do their better assessments of where we stand on sustainability performance as of today. And that addresses a little bit the risk. But, we often hear about greenwashing. Like you might have this wonderful sustainability report showing how well you're doing, but actually the outside world does not see it that way and has different information about you. And maybe there's a way with the AI systems to collect and sort of analyze that data as one picture instead of as two separate pictures. I think that's something that folks are excited about. And then one other last topic we talked about in our working group was something that has less to do with the technical aspects of AI and data and technology, and more to do with the psychological challenges behind getting people to act on longer term risks like climate change. And one of the ideas was, well, in all of this scenario planning and modeling, a lot of it today is sort of Excel spreadsheet based. So when we talk about our TCFD disclosures, it's an Excel spreadsheet. It's very hard to get people to engage with an Excel spreadsheet. I'm sorry, George, because for my finance colleagues, maybe it's very easy to engage with an Excel spreadsheet, but I find it challenging personally. And one of the things that could be interesting would be to say, well, can we start visualizing thanks to AI visualization techniques? Can we visualize what that risk means? Can we see it with our eyes or hear it or feel it in a way that's more emotional, that creates more connection? So it's not just a document. It's actually, I can understand in many different ways with many different forms of stimulus. I can understand what that risk means and how severe it might be, right? So George had mentioned, you have to model a failure. What would that feel like to experience that kind of a failure, a systemic failure, which could very well come from climate change? We talk about insurance perhaps being the weak link in sort of collapsing the the system around when the climate impacts that we know are going to come are actually going to hit at scale. So what would that feel like? And that's something that we think about technology being a way to help us sort of with very rational tasks. But I think it can also help us with some of the more emotional, creative tasks, especially the Gen AI and image capabilities.
Yeah.
Right. We might just add a couple of points.
Yep.
So Alice's point about the lack of emotion in spreadsheet, I mean, it's obviously true. I mean, I've spent my life setting targets, well, not my life, my finance career, setting targets for people. And when I tell them what the earnings growth target is going to be, what the margin target or what the ROE target is, it's very common for CEOs to turn around to me and say, I can't get my team to engage with that. What does it really mean? So I think what Alice describes as, I mean, using these tools to give it more life and more meaning, I think can be very powerful.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, as I listened to Alice, I mean, it was apparent to me that, I mean, she's describing something where AI is more like augmenting the process for humans rather than being the artificial intelligence that replaces it. And I think that's really important. I mean, I think I'd be surprised if we're going to see AI take these decisions on behalf of organizations. But as Alice described, you can bring a much richer source of information to people and hopefully help challenge them, make better decisions, even if there's no right answer there.
Yeah. I think great reflection right around how do you really make better decisions by thinking about things in a different manner. This that overview you gave, Alice, of some of the different use cases is kind of some great examples. We recently at our A4S internal audit and risk management forum meeting spoke specifically around internal audit and risk managers are thinking about the use of AI with sustainability data, and some of those examples you shared you resonated with some of the practitioners that were a part of that forum. So thanks for adding on that. I guess, George, in addition to what you just shared and perspective there, other thoughts of AI, and maybe let's also think about governance issues connected to AI. How are you kind of as a board member thinking about the use of AI and technologies within organizations?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting time to be a board member with these topics around. I mean, it's both very exciting, bit perplexing, bit scary. I think, I mean, one really simple thing, which is probably obvious to most people, is that I've never seen anything that didn't look good on a PowerPoint presentation. I think maybe you could ask to see something live. So if you think of, I mean, harder to look at how a large language model is processing something, but I mean, there are ways that you can look at the audit trail of how information flows through these things. And same for agentic AI. I mean, if you look at how people put these processes together, there are specific tools that are designed to produce audit trails, connections, and link back to source material. And I think when you've seen a few of if you've seen a few of these run in the real world, you can see, I mean, something that underpins one of the other comments that Alice made, which was about people's expectations of what it can deliver versus what you actually get from it. So I think as a board, you need to get away from the standard, simple presentation in front of you and ask to see it in the real world and try and demystify it a bit.
Yeah. Great. And I wonder, Alice, picking up on that and thinking about, getting trust and accountability within AI and technologies, what are you seeing? Any kind of good practices? How are you approaching it within an organization, really thinking about making sure that the use of AI and technologies is, transparent, it's audible, it's aligned with your values and your organization?
Yeah, I think that's a $1 million question. I don't think anybody has found how to provide that kind of reassurance at the broad scale. I mean, you see a lot of concern from ethics organizations, from also from women's organizations. That there's about the bias that's built into AI, about all these. I think there's a lot of concern, and that's this goes beyond the finance community, beyond the sustainability community. Certainly, these are structural challenges, I think, for society. We are building these things faster than we are able to sort of understand them, or at least for most people. This is going faster than what most people can understand. And the implications of them are quite profound in terms of the way society might function in the future. And most people are not participating in that process and don't have a view of how this will work. And And of course, we see some of the more worrisome examples of how AI can be used in not great ways, in democracy and all these types of things. So I think within an organization, you're sort of a microcosm of that. And I mean, my organization is certainly trying to do its best. And we set up an AI policy very early on that has a commitment to ethics and transparency and data. And we try to build that into when we do procurement of AI tools. What is the traceability? What is our ability to understand how decisions are made within the algorithms? So we're trying to put some guardrails around, but this is such a big topic. And that was one of, in the work stream we had with A4S, one of the issues is this goes so far beyond what any single organization can do. We really do have to work together. And I think, business associations do have a role to play in saying, we also want some guardrails or some transparency or some forms of regulation. You see Europe going in one direction, really trying to regulate. You see a deregulation now in the U.S. on some of this. I don't hear a lot of business voices speaking up, being very loud about, listen, like we need some sort of transparency here. And I think there is a role to play there, and I hope that that will come. But right now, it feels very much like individual organizations just trying to figure it out on their own. Whereas I think it's too big of a problem in some ways to fix. And the other issues, I mean, we did talk about it within our working group. We gave some examples already in this discussion about some of the wonderful things that AI could do for sustainability, getting people to understand like what climate risk means and these big topics. Um, but we also talked about, what one of the sort of very particular downsides to AI in the sustainability space, which is of course the energy consumption. And we're now talking about being off track for the Paris Agreement. One of the primary reasons might be our build out of AI capacity and the energy consumption that will go with it. That might completely derail the trajectories we thought we might be on. And that's pretty serious. That's a pretty serious concern. So as this sort of enthusiasm for all the wonderful things AI can do for sustainability is I think legitimate and is real, and we have to invest in those things. I think there is this concern that for every time we do a search that is AI enabled, um, we like to talk about you're essentially using a day's worth of a light bulb. I work in the lighting industry, right? Just for that one question. And that I don't think people have realized that either, how that consumption, which we've just opened it up now, almost every search we're doing on the internet is based on an AI response, is no longer doing traditional search. That comes with a very severe cost. And the cost benefit equation is not one that most people are doing when you're just asking Google a question like you always did, but now it's being powered in a much different way and in a way that's quite dangerous for the environment. So I think that's one of the things that came up in our working group. Do we have a solution to that? No. But could business be, or for the finance community or the business community, be vocal about that? Yes, I think so. I think so.
Yeah, thanks for that. And maybe George, anything else to add on the kind of governance, trust, accountability of the use of AI? I think Alice presented, a few of the complexities around this. Any thoughts on ways to address some of these issues?
I mean, I think Alice's response was pretty comprehensive. I mean, I would echo it. I think again, for me, asking for transparency around, I mean, all the topics she's raised here. I think if you have more information at your fingertips, you're better informed, you can make better decisions. I think the risk is when you're not aware, you can take decisions that you think are good for the short term, but they have very negative consequences in the long term. So for me, the key issue would be transparency.
Yep.
I
Great.
actually, just to add a last point there, I read a study just yesterday that said that people's use of AI was inversely correlated to their understanding of how it works. And I think that's very, very worrisome, actually. So folks who are very well informed about the energy impact, about some of the ethics issues, or the quality of the information that are very careful about where they're using AI and where they're not using AI. They're using it only for very specific purposes that they know it's actually adapted for. But the folks who don't understand the machine behind it are using it almost all the time for questions about, life advice and, what should I do with my husband tonight? And, all sorts of all sorts of things that probably, we should think twice about posing the question. But anyway, I thought that was a very interesting study.
That is so. Plenty of challenges for sure, and I think we've hit a few practical solutions, but definitely a lot of challenges on the horizon to figure out how to address this kind of ever changing world on these topics of AI technology and decision making. Just to close out the session though, let's think of a bit of a more positive note beyond the challenges, and I was hoping maybe each of you could share one thing that you take away from this year, 2025, that really gives you some optimism, some hope for the year ahead in 2026. Maybe George, then Alice. George.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the best person to start with. I mean, I'm Scottish and I spent my entire career in finance and insurance. There's nothing about this that screams optimism or positivity. Having said that, though, one of the great experiences I've had this year, the team that I've worked with on the fast track effort around decision making, it's a very diverse group of people. You've got people from the finance world, we've got academics, there's a wide range of different voices there. And they all come at it with a tremendous energy. For someone who tends to be skeptical about everything and looking for the flaws, it was just great fun to spend time with this group. None of them are jaded. None of them have lost enthusiasm. They're really upbeat about, how this can contribute. And maybe it shouldn't have surprised me, but it did a bit in a really positive way.
Great, Alice.
So I'd agree with that. Fundamentally, the thing that gives me hope, because I also tend to be quite pessimistic, is when you connect with people and realize there are so many people pushing in the same direction. And in fact, if you look at research out there, despite the politics, despite all of this, the recent studies asking people, would you like to your country or your company to do more on climate or more on diversity? Most people still say yes. Those numbers have not moved, and businesses also still say yes, and those numbers have not moved. And so, one of the things that struck me from Climate Week was a quote, not mine, but from somebody else who was speaking in an event, who said the sustainability transition and the energy transition is losing in the political economy and in the attention economy, so social media and all of that. But it's absolutely winning in the real economy, in the real world. People still care. People are still investing. Solar panels are still cheaper than coal mines. There are all these amazing wins when you think about where people thought electric vehicles would be, where people thought renewable energy would be today. We have gone far beyond where we thought we could be right now. So I think that's something to keep in mind, is that there's what you see, there's a huge disconnect. It's called the perception gap between what people think is happening and what's actually happening. And I think we need to just reconnect to those people we run into who remind us of what's actually happening and what people actually want. And that's what's going to provide hope and energy.
The perfect comment to end on. So thank you, George. Thank you, Alice. Really appreciate your insights and time today, and for joining the A4S Online Summit. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'll now hand over the session to my colleague, Kira Burke, A4S Director for Europe. She'll be continuing this conversation with Rob Doepel and Jojo Rouse, both from EY.
Thank you, Brad. Rob and Jojo, welcome to the A4S Online Summit. By way of a short introduction, Rob is the Managing Partner for Sustainability in the UK and Ireland at EY, and Jojo Rouse is the Senior Manager in EY's Climate Change and Sustainability Services team. So today they will be sharing their perspectives on transition planning, drawing on real-world client experiences and practical insights. So I look forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Thanks, Kira. Great to be with everyone today. And yeah, we thought might be worthwhile providing and starting with this a little bit of context and market context for transition planning. Obviously, the session that Alice and George have gone through on decision making, we like to think that transition planning is really a key driver of getting the right data to make better decisions and more important important decisions for the long-term strategy of businesses. So we've got a few slides. I'm joined here by Jojo, and we'll just take you through a little bit of that context. So if we look at what is transition planning, and I just have to admit, I have a slight challenge with the word transition planning because it feels already that it's been tucked under compliance, because obviously transition planning is part of ISSB in some parts of the world, and is also part of other regulatory reporting requirements. But for me, transition planning is really more strategic long-term planning. And if you look at what some of the leading clients are doing on that long-term strategic planning, is they're really thinking through the implications of climate and the impact of that's going to have on your long-term business. So on the left there is sort of a high-level view of the what we mean by transition planning. And the way to think about this is you start with your base case there, on the first yellow bar, and then you can project forward depending on if you're going out for 2030, 2035, 2050, is if you do nothing, and there's no change in your business, what do your financed emissions look like out in that timeline? And then you have a set of interventions that you can play with to try and get yourself down closer to a target, closer to a net zero target. And there are lots of different categories one can use, but we like to keep it with our clients fairly high level for communication purposes. And you can see some of the buckets that we typically use here when developing a transition plan. So there's obviously things coming from government policy. So there's things that are somewhat out of an organization's control. But looking at jurisdictional government policy, there will be some things that change which have an impact on emissions. Lots of clients are doing a lot of work on electrification, and a solid transition to electrification within your operations can also have a significant hit on emissions. Then things like engagement, which is engaging with your supply chain, so out with your third parties and getting them to make changes to the way that they operate will have an impact on your emissions as well. And then you get into some more interesting areas around product types and portfolio optimization, and composition. So this is really starting to get into some detail around, are your products fit for purpose in a carbon world, and is your portfolio fit for purpose in a carbon constrained world? And when you've done all that, you've done all those levers, there will always be a little bit left over. In this graph, it's a small line of green, but for many clients, it's a lot bigger than that. And we call that sort of the unabated emissions. And this is where the gap, this is where you're looking for technologies or something perhaps we don't know about, an innovation that's going to have to kick in to address those unabated emissions. And so why are we doing this? On the right-hand side, I think it's been interesting the last 12 months at least, that those two grey areas, at least the perception is that we've got decreased pressure coming from investors, and obviously some changes from a regulatory environment as well, with some potential watering down, or at least some delay of some key regulations particularly here in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well. And as Alice and George mentioned before, I don't think that's entirely true, and there's a little bit of rhetoric above reality. But one of the things that we also push is they are not just the two reasons why it's important to be thinking about your long-term strategic planning, and actually as a business doing planning perhaps beyond the time horizon that you're typically doing your strategic planning. And there's those two yellow areas there around cost and revenue, and really starting to explore what are some of the potential efficiencies that can be gained by really pulling hard on some of these transition levers, but also what are some of the upsides? What are some of the potential opportunities out there that thinking about your product portfolio, thinking about the way you operate can actually improve and perhaps drive new revenue streams? And then I think that the one that's very hard to quantify is that strategic influence. But within a sector, your ability to lead a sector to start really driving consumer behavior, driving the direction of a sector or a subsector, can also start to spin the wheel faster from that cost and revenue potential upsides. If we just move on to the next piece, again, just a little bit of market context and perhaps a little bit of good news around some information, some data that we gathered from our clients on a global survey. So lots of stats on this slide, but we are from EY, so we do like our numbers and we do like our data. But you can see on the top left there, two stats, which I think are quite positive. Now, these are the two stats actually from a UK survey. All the rest of the data on the slide is actually from a global survey we did of 2,000 globally important organizations. But just here in the UK, and I think it's sometimes helpful just to look at one jurisdiction that has got, I suppose, a quite aggressive government and from a political and also from a regulation perspective, and has been really driving the uptake of transition planning here in the UK. And you can see there that currently 83% of UK companies will say that they've increased the quality of their transition plans and their transition planning disclosures year on year. And 57% of UK companies that we surveyed reported that they're quantifying the adoption measures for the physical risks that have been identified through that transition planning exercise. So there's some quite positive news from one market. But even when you look at the global stats here, and you can see across the bottom there is a range of sort of maturity around transition planning, all the way from complete unawareness to having a transition plan and fully implemented. And you can see there that the majority of organizations that we spoke to and we measured were at level 3, we're in the center of this, which is really around integrating into operational decision making. And I think that's true for the majority of the clients that I work with as well. I would say we're now into the sort of second phase of transition planning. The first phase perhaps was starting to think about what transition meant for you as an organization within the sector in which you operate. And we had a first stab, and maybe at sort of level 1, level 2 awareness and building capability and capacity. But I think now we're at a different stage where we're seeing organizations really think harder around their transition planning, the impacts of the transition planning, but also doing a lot more detailed data modeling. And if I think about one organization, a FTSE 10 here in the UK that we've been working with, they've done a lot of work on detailed modeling to support their long-term strategy. And that's modeling around their product footprint, understanding the carbon impact of that product, looking at different products they're bringing to market and what the relative impacts of those products would be, and then really playing sort of what-if analysis across that product portfolio to really understand what the impact would be and could be for their organization going forward, both from the risks and the opportunities. So I think we're seeing a different level of maturity around transition planning within the market. And actually, if we just pop onto the next slide, I just want to reflect a little bit on what that means for finance, because I think the other large sort of trend that we're seeing working with our clients is the role of finance and finance really stepping into this market and really stepping into transition planning. And there's sort of 4 areas, if we just pop onto the next slide, that cover this. And I think historically, perhaps this is not with finance, maybe been involved, but not fully integrated into the thought process around strategic planning for transition. But what we're seeing now is increasingly finance functions, CFOs, being much more engaged in this conversation. And really it's because of these four areas. Obviously, it's super important for risk and return. So around value protection and value creation, if you're not really involved in thinking through the implications of life in a carbon constrained world, then the question is you're not really playing the role effectively around looking for those value opportunities and mitigating risks. I think finance has also spent a lot more time being pulled into the management of non-financial data. So just that process of capturing and controlling and reporting financial information has also brought finance closer into the data required to do high quality transition planning. But more important than the bottom two, I think, and what's increasingly helpful for organizations is that integration with financial planning and decision making. And again, leading organizations bringing this framework, bringing the transition planning framework that Jojo is going to talk to just in a moment, more into the financial planning and decision making process on a short-term basis. So transition planning typically is sort of run at the moment. We're looking, I think the regulations are going to push us to start doing transition planning every 3 years with updates in between if there's a material change to operations. So you end up with a sort of a two-step model of transition planning being very long-term and then your financial planning decision making being more in the short term. But the integration of those two is super important and really the role of finance, and where finance can play a really important role of bringing those long-term strategic decisions into the here and now, into the short term. And lastly, around process and controls, I talked about finance leading into non-financial data. Increasingly, finance is the mechanism, it is the muscle in an organization that's able to process and control high quality and high integrity data. And that's exactly what we need for non-financial information. So finance playing an increasingly prominent role around ensuring that our non-financial data, the data that's required for transition planning, is in a good state. So Jojo, I might just bring you in here just to sort of talk through a little bit more around that, the transition planning framework and the role that finance have to play.
Great, thank you, Rob. So this may or may not be familiar to many of you. This is the Transition Plan Task Force Disclosure Framework, and it is considered to be kind of what good looks like when you're working on a transition plan for an organization. As Rob mentioned, the kind of maturity of the market for transition planning has definitely evolved over the last few years, and we've seen finance needing to kind of lean in and get more involved from a accuracy kind of maturity perspective. So we actually saw 46% of the FTSE 100 restating their ESG disclosure data over the last year or so, which really just shows that sustainability has maybe become less about public announcements. So you're hearing about it much less, but actually it's becoming a lot more credible and something that can be used in the market. So the Transition Plan Task Force have got this disclosure framework, which as I said, you can kind of use it to inform what makes a good transition plan. And we've highlighted on here the elements that finance can take, kind of play a key part in. So the lighter yellow showing where finance might support or just have some lighter touch involvement. And then the darker yellow areas being finance led and very much kind of a core part of the finance role. So just to kind of bring that to life a little bit. So in 1.1 strategic ambition, finance's involvement would probably be supporting the team who have set a net zero target, for example, with a marginal abatement cost curve. So just actually costing up what we are committing to when we're saying that we will get to net zero. If we look at in section 2, so within implementation strategy, as Rob's outlined, kind of you might have a mix of products needing to change depending on the carbon intensity of different areas of the portfolio. And I'm sure that finance kind of modelling would support the underlying non-financial planning from that perspective also. If we come into 2.4, financial planning, this is really the area that finance plays a key role, and it's an area when developing the framework has had quite a lot of pushback and challenge, mostly because of how challenging some of this actually is to do. So to kind of quote the TPT framework, financial planning is how an entity is planning to resource its transition plan. And so that kind of is broken into two parts. So the first part is how will implementation of the transition plan affect the financial position of the business over the short, medium, long term. So just to kind of put that into more financial terms, so if you're thinking like CapEx spend, so are you likely to need to revalue, write off, impair, retire any existing assets due to the transition? Are there maybe any costs that will be incurred to ensure assets are resilient to physical climate risk? So, for example, if you do manufacturing as part of your business, is there any issues that will from flooding for factories, for example? Is there anything that you need to consider from a CapEx perspective there? Are you going to be upgrading or retrofitting any assets? So that kind of making old buildings more efficient type activities. It also, so the 2.4 financial planning is then also made up of how will implementation of the transition plan affect your financial performance. So this is thinking more of the kind of cash flows, revenue, profit in year. So again, just to kind of give you some examples of that, you might be needing to consider whether renewable energy generation or what your procurement strategy is to meet those targets that you set geographically. So whether or not you need to be considering different costs for different areas, whether or not any energy efficiency measures will reduce consumption and therefore cost. What will be financial implications of the changing regulatory landscape that Rob's already outlined? There might also be some key sources of revenue that don't currently align with the transition plan, and how will these be mitigated and how will we kind of account for these, whether that will be something that needs to be offset in the future, which also then has a financial implication, or whether it's going to be kind of wound down in terms of the portfolio. So there's lots of things within 2.4 financial planning, and actually A4S have got some great material on this on their website. So it's a complicated area and definitely an area that finance will play a critical role. If I keep going along kind of the disclosure elements then, so we come into the accountability section. So metrics and targets. Clearly 4.2 financial metrics and targets will be a key area for finance involvement also. And then also just in terms of governance, actually embedding this and ensuring that we have accountability across the organization. So finance will need to support with, for example, incentives and remuneration to incentivize the right activities to actually deliver the transition plan. So as you can sort of see from this diagram, there's a lot of areas where finance can lead and there are areas where finance can support. But if we go into the next slide, thank you. I think this brings to life how and why finance should be leaning in perhaps more than they are already. So this is something that we call the transition planning value bridge. And this effectively shows the impact to EBITDA of different components or different blocks of activity, depending on different outcomes. So the left-hand side of the graph shows if you do nothing, these will be impacts to your potential profit margin over the next 5 years. And then we've got on the right-hand side, opportunities to redeem that depreciation of margin. So if I just walk through the left-hand side here, which is costs that might be incurred and impact the bottom line for the business. These are sector agnostic graph. So it's kind of, there's some of these that may or may not be relevant to your organization. But starting from the left then, so we've got obviously regulatory pressure, which comes with the cost. So we've got things like carbon taxes that will be implemented, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, which you may already be being impacted by. We've got potential litigation for greenwashing prevention and also potential claims. So there's lots of regulatory pressure, and that bar may be larger or smaller depending on the sector that you sit in. If we come on to the next one then, so supply chain disruption and resource scarcity as well. So if I just bring this to life, for nature depletion, one example might be if you're a hotel group or a hotel organization and you are looking at new investments in a water scarce area, it might impact the long-term profitability of that location for tourism. So it would be something that you would need to be considering as something that might impact the general revenue of that particular asset. If we have a look then at technological and asset obsolescence. So in here we've got obviously things like stranded assets, missed innovation cycles, lagging capabilities depending on tech advancements. These are all kind of things that are potentially in that unknown bucket at the moment, but over the next 5 years or so, you should be able to start putting together the potential cost implications of this. In terms of cost of financing, this is an area that finance feel is already comfortably kind of their responsibility, but insurance is one that's kind of front of mind with the increasing frequency of natural disasters. So it's likely that insurance premiums will go up depending on the geography, and some assets even becoming potentially uninsurable depending on the location. So this is something that will be could be more material depending on the nature of the business. We've also got cost of capital. So organizations that kind of are weaker in this area may end up experiencing increased costs of capital, and also just the compliance costs of any lender and investor requirements. So, for example, I know I'm working with a private equity portfolio company recently, and the private equity owner has got quite stringent requirements on the portco. So they have to do lots of additional kind of work and preparation, which obviously comes with resource cost. And then finally, the point, market and reputation erosion here on the bar. So this is anything that kind of might impact sales. So things like, are you able to retain contracts? Do you have sufficient ESG compliance that would meet with due diligence criteria that your customers would need to assess? Is there something that will impact customer trust if you've kind of said you're going to do something and then you end up not being able to deliver on it? This is also something that's really important for talent retention and for your ability to recruit, particularly in kind of younger generations. It's something that's really important for attracting top talent. So all of these things on the left are things that will happen in a world where we don't take any intervention. And then Rob's going to just talk us through on the right-hand side the it's not so bad, actually you can do something about it bars.
Well, thanks, Jojo. And look, I think the left-hand side here, this sort of the risk side of the equation, I think, has really been where the focus has been. And I think regulation has sort of pushed us down that road somewhat around quantifying risk, quantifying the impact, typically being on a negative side, the impact of changes in the environment, changes in climate and the environment in which we operate. I think there's a little bit of human nature in that as well, however, which is typically we're pretty good at spending time, and maybe in finance professionals as well, as like thinking around the downside and thinking about the risks and trying to quantify what could go wrong. And on the right-hand side here of the page is really the more imaginative world. It's the what ifs, and it's a value creation, which is typically, I think, where a lot of organizations perhaps struggle more. And one of the things that at least we're hearing a lot at the moment is, can you help us the value case for sustainability? Help us define the value case for sustainability. Because in many organizations, quite rightly, the questions being asked around, are we investing too much in sustainability? Has the market evolved? Is it really being valued anymore by investors and by our stakeholders? And I think this is probably the area of focus for 2026. If I had a wand, I'd say getting better, and organizations getting better at defining the value that is at stake, or the value opportunity from leaning into transition and leading into sustainability, I think will be super important for 26. And without sort of draining all these little bars, you can see I've already picked up on some of these earlier. But the first two there around sustainable products and service innovation. And that really is around innovation. And it's thinking around what are those future products? What are the future services that perhaps we could introduce, we could adapt, we could amend our existing portfolio, and really going after some different areas of the market. And that requires interaction with your marketing teams, with the sales teams, with the product development teams, with R&D, and really getting them to think around what are some of the opportunities that exist for us as an organization. And then we've got lots of examples of organizations that have perhaps started on looking at supply chains and looking at things like circularity, sometimes driven because of a regulatory requirement or in a requirement to show some progress. And actually what they found is huge value opportunities in terms of things like logistics, packaging, weight, that come through when you start looking and thinking differently about your supply chain and around the circularity of your products. And that also drives into the operational and resource efficiency as well. So with that, thinking harder around the value opportunities, and I think it is harder to quantify, it's harder to measure, and it's actually hard to get engagement in an organization to be thinking long-term about value, perhaps than it is around risk. But organizations increasingly are going to have to get the balance between these two sides of the value bridge. In the market and customer growth, we've been talking about green premium products for some time. They are still there. There are still some examples that are coming through, and I think we're going through an interesting time around some cold winds around things like green products and green premiums. I think all the evidence and all the research tells us that there is still an underlying demand, for those green services at the right price. So ensuring to keep thinking about those market and customer growth opportunities. And as Jojo said on the finance side, there's perhaps downsides that need to be managed from a finance perspective, but there will be upsides as well. And again, we've probably had a cycle looking at green finance, and we'll go through another cycle. And at least our view is that there will be premiums in the market for organizations that can show better progress against their sustainability goals, both from a cost of capital perspective and also from lower insurance. Maybe we're double counting on the insurance there on this slide. But I think the message there really is around you've got to get some balance in the conversation around, yes, you've got to quantify the risks, as Jojo took us through, but actually there's more work, and actually the harder work perhaps at the moment is on that yellow side, thinking around the value creation opportunities. Jojo, anything have I missed that I should have picked up as we went through those?
No, that was comprehensive. Thanks.
Just some reflections, I think, for organizations as they move into 2026. And as we cover there, how will the transition affect how your business creates and protects value? I think there's been lots of work done on protection, not enough work done on creation. And are you ready? And are you feeling fully abreast and up to speed on the changes that are going to come from different regulatory bodies around the world and a very complex stakeholder stakeholder environment with different expectations in different geographies? I think being fully informed and fully aware around what is happening in each of the different regions, both from a regulatory perspective, but also from broader stakeholder groups in those regions, is going to be increasingly important when defining your global strategy. And then lastly, around transition plans, which is what we've been focusing on in this session, is what role will you as finance and finance professionals play in shaping your organization's transition plan? I think there's huge remit for finance to become more involved. As I said, finance is always the home of high integrity data, which is so fundamental to underpin a high quality transition plan. So if finance isn't involved in that at the moment, our call is you've got to get involved and you've got to lean in harder to start driving those high quality transition plans.
Thank you both for those insights. Lots of really interesting information to digest. Lots I have seen from our member organisations that kind of really tallies in terms of the important role that finance needs to play. I do have one question for you, please, which I think links very much to the sort of the eloquent points that Jojo made around 2.4 and 4.2 within transition planning. But what we notice is that it is increasingly recognised that we need financially credible transition plans in order to attract investment. So can you provide some perspectives on, how can our organisations listening help to build that financially credible transition plan?
Well, I'll start, Jojo, and then you can maybe jump in.
Yeah.
Let me just talk about an example. Probably the best way to do that is around and really around that credibility of the transition plan. And I'm just sort of mindful of the organisation we've been working with for pretty much all calendar year, who had a transition plan and had published a transition plan and were compliant from a regulatory perspective around their transition plan. But I suppose the question was it really credible? And did it really signify the capital required to progress on that transition? And the answer on both of those was no. It was good, but it wasn't detailed enough. And we started therefore a process of going, actually, we need to improve the quality of this transition plan to make it bankable. The reality is that was like a classic sort of opening up a can of worms in terms of once we opened up the box, what then happened was the depth of the strategic decisions and the strategic discussions that had to be had to quantify that in a more robust manner were profound, and it needed all parts of the organisation involved. So the program grew a little bit of arms and legs in terms of who was involved in the organisation, because it became pretty clear pretty quickly that we needed R&D, we needed product, we needed marketing and sales, we needed supply chain procurement, we needed all parts of the business engaged in this program. And then the modelling, the detail and the depth of the modelling was at a different level than they'd ever done before. But what that's done at the back of that has built them. They haven't got all the answers on transition, but they now feel they've got a really solid base around some of the options that they have. So when they're speaking to their investors, and they actually presented this to an investor forum. This client had around about 88% of their investors, of their shareholder registry present, and they just talked them through what they were thinking, what the decisions that they had made, what the decisions that they still need to make in the future. But it provided a level of detail and security, I suppose, that drew great engagement from their stakeholders. As I said, I haven't got all the answers about what they're going to do, but in terms of financially credible, what it has done is it's helped them in terms of that stakeholder group, and has now probably set a sort of a baseline or a forum for them to continue to engage with their stakeholders and their shareholders around the decisions they need to make going forward. Jojo, you're a little bit involved in that project as well, so if there's anything else you want to add on that.
I think just the one thing I would sort of say is to consider having different levels of detail for the same plan, depending on the audience. So having a really detailed, robust plan that's fully costed and considers all of the financial components we've talked through for the internal plan to be used as a good strategic document that you can kind of actually hold yourself accountable to. There is then a different version of the same story, which is something that you can put into the public domain as your kind of nice, shiny transition plan, as people think of them being. And there's maybe something in the middle, which is what Rob is kind of describing, which is there then like a financial audience view specifically for your investors or lenders that you want to share another cut of that kind of super detailed transition plan that you're using internally, that you wouldn't necessarily want, all your competitors to read. So I think that's the main thing, which is just to say that there can be different levels of detail of the same thing that you can use depending on the audience.
Thank you. I think that's a really helpful and really practical insights there from both of you. And I think to your point, Rob, it helps to bring to light that within all the organisations who are making progress in this, even some who are really leaders still have progress to make. That like there is no perfect organisation yet who has nailed everything on this agenda. It's an evolving landscape. We're constantly learning. And I think that's what you've showed. It's the opportunity. What does this bring to light about our stakeholders and risks and opportunities through going through this process in a more strategic lens than simply a regulatory tick box exercise. So thank you both. I'm conscious of time, so thank you both for the insights that you've shared today. It's been really fascinating, and I'm sure everyone who's tuned in has found it really interesting and taken away some actions. So thank you, both of you.
Thanks, Kira.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. And over to you, Brad.
Thank you, Kiara. And thank you again to all of the guests for today's session, Alice, George, Rob, and Jojo. We really appreciate you being part of the A4S Online Summit. And thank you for those that have been joining in to today's session. I hope you found it useful and insightful as you think about your own role in accelerating the transition. If you'd like to learn more or sign up for our A4S newsletter, please visit our website where you can find additional information about A4S events and publications. I also encourage you to watch additional sessions of the A4S Online Summit, which will be available live and for playback. Thanks again for joining us. Take care.